Hi, it's Kristen, and it's time for another Feminist Friday. So this time round, I'm doing another non-fiction book, and I'm going to be reading Better, Faster, Farther by Maggie Mertens. I heard about this book when I listened to a podcast called You're Wrong About, hosted by a woman called Sarah Marshall, and she had Maggie on as a guest for one episode, and they were talking about a woman who faked coming first, I think, in the women's division of, I want to say it was like the Boston Marathon. It was like one of the big marathons, and this woman, pretended she came first by doing like a shortcut and like coming out further along the course and just basically like not running the whole thing. And it took a while for her to be found out, but eventually like people did clock that she was lying. That was like a really interesting episode, and at the end of the episode Sarah Marshall was like, promote yourself, Maggie, and she talked about this book that she had written about the history of women in running. I listened to that podcast episode while I was out on a run, and I just thought it sounded so interesting. So when my brother didn't know what to get me for Christmas last year, I said, hey, there's this book I keep meaning to buy, but I never buy it for myself because it's in hardcover. But like I'd really like this, so he bought it for me. And I've had it, and I keep meaning to read it, and I keep not picking it up, and I meant to read it earlier this year, like for timing wise for my life, but I didn't get around to it, so now I'm finally going to read it. If you didn't know, I've talked about it on my channel before, just casually in vlogs, because like it takes up time in my life, but I run. I am not a fast runner, not a brilliant runner by any means, but last year in 2025 I did a half marathon. I've previously done a half marathon in 2019, but that the half marathon itself was fine. The training and getting to the point of that half marathon was a wild ride. I was doing really well with my training, and then I was hospitalized for 5 days with an issue with like my skin on my foot. Went into the to A&E. They were like, we're gonna keep you overnight. Ended up staying there for nearly a week, and then when I got out of hospital, I couldn't walk very well. I was on crutches for a while. My foot was bandaged up. I couldn't like run for like a month or two. So only got back into training for that half marathon about a month before the half marathon. To top things off, I was hospitalised on my birthday, which was very fun for me. So that was 2019, and after that I stopped running for a while just because like I didn't need to train anymore. I'd done the half marathon, so I wasn't like aiming for anything. But then I decided a little while ago that for my 30th birthday I was going to do the half marathon again. And the half marathon was taking place last year, like 3 days after my 30th birthday. So I was like, let's ring in 30 by running half marathon. And I did that. And then I thought, let's see out 30 and enter into 31 by running a marathon. So I then trained for a marathon, and earlier this year in April I ran a marathon. It was all right. It was a lot of work. Training was pretty horrible throughout winter. It was cold, it was wet, it was icy sometimes. It's just like, I'm not a fast runner, so like the hours on my feet was pretty intense. It was just like being tired and hungry all the time. it's just very time consuming basically. But I did it in April. My goal, because as I said, I'm not a fast runner, was to do it in sub 6 hours, which I did. I'm very happy about that. I raised money for the charity I worked for, and I raised quite a lot of money, which I was really happy with. So anyway, that's like backstory, rambling backstory of why I'm interested in running. I'm a runner and I have an interest in women and women's history and like women in society and like the culture and stuff like that. And so I thought this would be really interesting because this is basically just, yeah, the history of women in running and how women got into running and when they were like allowed to run. I think we start off with like a little bit of maybe myth of like women running, and then like the first like written or like oral recording that we have of a woman running like years ago, and then we jump forward to like more modern times, like within the 1900s, of women first being allowed in like a running club or being allowed to run a certain distance officially, and then like women getting into the Olympics and all that stuff. And I believe we do also cover like not just white women, but like the history of women of colour being allowed to run, and like how white women and women of colour are like perceived in running. And I think there's also a chapter about like trans women as well, and them being included or excluded from like sports generally, but especially when it comes to running. I know a few female runners, and so I'm sure like some of them will come up in here, but I'm also excited to like learn about more women and learn facts I never knew, and like historical stuff. But also I'm like preparing myself to be very frustrated and angry just from all the like misogyny and sexism that I'm sure is in here. So yes, let's learn about women running. So I've been reading Better, Faster, Farther, and I'm really enjoying it. It's very frustrating to read because obviously you're just reading a lot about like men not letting women run and compete and like do what they're good at and telling them that they can't. But it's like really interesting, and I'm learning stuff that I didn't know. I'm learning like historical contexts for things. I didn't know that in the 1928 Olympics, which was like the first time women were allowed to do like track and field and athletics events, women competed in the 800 meters. And then because of how it went and how it was reported it went, they got rid of the 800 meters and didn't reintroduce it until years later. Because although it went fine and all the women finished, loads of news reports were like, the women collapsed at the end and fainted and couldn't go on, even though there's no record of that happening. And Maggie Mertens, when talking about like researching this and finding photos and videos and like what little there was in the archives from that event, she says there's like video of the start line and them starting the race, and then there's video of the finish line, and you see like the first and second place finish, and then you see a woman like trip at the finish and have to be like helped up by a man. But when she was working out which competitor that was who tripped, she realised it's not actually from that race, because that woman is wearing a different outfit to any of the women at the starting line. And so this like official archive clips of the women's 800 metres 1928 Olympic final has a video of a woman tripping that was not in the actual race. But because of that, and because like people were just making shit up, it's reported like that event didn't go well and they got rid of it. And so stuff like that is so frustrating, but such an interesting thing to learn. And she focuses on like a few different women in the chapters and follows like them competing or like getting involved in an organisation or something, which is really interesting to learn about. So I finished chapter 1, which was about like not running more than like 100 meters, and now I'm on to chapter 2, which is about like only white women competing. Finding it really interesting, very frustrating, but like it's also written in a way which is very informative and is giving like dates and facts and names, but is very readable still. I don't feel like I'm bogged down in the information. It doesn't feel too academic or anything. So yeah, I'm having a good time learning a lot. Different day, same spot. This continues to be an incredibly interesting, incredibly frustrating book to read. So I've read the section now that's about like race when it comes to racing, with like a focus on the US and the way that their black female runners were treated. We're talking in like the 20s, 30s, 40s. And there's like a whole thing about how the 2 black women who won medals for the US, the media in America was like obsessed with the like white Dutch runner. And there was all this news coverage about this woman from another country who just was like very feminine, blonde, long hair. She was like a wife and a mother, and she was just seen as like peak, like beauty of an athlete. And she was a very good athlete. She did win a bunch of medals at the Olympics. But yeah, the US media was like obsessed with her, and all their coverage was about her, even though they had their own athletes who got medals. There's also cases of how like black athletes were supposed to run in races, were like on a team, but then would never get chosen to run the race, even if they actually had like a better qualifying time than some of the white women runners. And it's stuff like that that isn't surprising to me, but it's still like baffling, and still it feels shocking that these things ever happened, and it feels shocking and horrible that they did happen, but not surprising, if you get what I mean. Like, I'm not surprised about any of the sexist, racist treatment, sadly, but it is still, yeah, shocking. And then the other section I've read was about like the first woman to run a mile that's been like recorded, and about like the mile time records being lowered by like men and women, and how in the same year a man broke the male 4-minute mile record, and there was a woman, Diane Leather, I think, who broke the women's English record, but not world record, because technically there was no world record at that time, because no world records were kept for women running more than 1,000 meters until like much later in time. So At the time, she like technically had the world record, but it wasn't an official record. Yeah, man broke the 4-minute mile record for men. Woman broke the 5-minute mile record for women. And like coincidentally, years later, when they both died, they died in the same year as well. And the BBC like sports personality of the year show that they do, which always has like an in memoriam section for athletes and sports personalities who died, Bannister, the man, was included in the in memoriam, and Leather was not, which again doesn't surprise me. There's so much in here that's like feels shocking but not surprising if you understand what I mean by that. So still learning so much. Now I'm up to the section that's about marathon running, which I think potentially I might find the most interesting as someone who has done like long distance running. The fact that like it wasn't that long ago that women just weren't allowed to run marathons, like in the grand scheme of life and earth and humans being alive. It was only like 20 to 30 years before I was born that women were even included. And the first few years of women being included was like horrible for women because it was still so few women and like male participants. While some were supportive, some were very much not. And like race officials tried to pull women like off the course and yeah, just like opposed them running because it was still like not advised by doctors for a woman to run that far. There was a woman called Bobby Gibb who wanted to run in Boston Marathon, but she wasn't allowed to because it would have to be in the men's division of the race because there was no women's division, because the longest sanctioned women's race was 1.5 miles, which isn't even a 5k. Like, that's wild to me. So this is when like I get really angry about like feminism and women's rights, that in 1966 women weren't even allowed to officially race in anything more than 1.5 miles. And now everyday people like me are out here running marathons because of what these women like pushed for and achieved. And that just makes me like, you know, I can't even articulate. Everything's been so interesting so far, so frustrating. But it is really cool to learn about these women whose like lives, even outside of like running and athleticism, are incredibly impressive. Like the women who then went on to be like coaches and teachers and just do cool stuff in their lives. And like, yeah, just learning about them. And I want to like, I want it to be loads of biopics. I would make biopics about like all these women if I could. So I'm continuing to read a book, and I've reached points where like I remember this stuff happening. Like we're in the 2010s now, and the author's talking about like Caster Semenya and all the stuff that happened with her and them like testing her DNA and stuff. And like I remember the news reports about that. And although it should have occurred to me because like athletes generally, like sprinters and stuff, tend to be on the younger side, I didn't realise she was only 18 when like the fuss was first kicked up about her. And that's just like wild to me that these other athletes who were like calling her out for being a man were just like bullying
this 18-year-old girl, and like, oh my god, so horrible. And then it turns out that like the woman who ended up beating Castus Menier at like the Olympics and stuff, who was one of the people who was like calling her a man and calling for her to be tested, she was suspended for doping a couple of years later and taking steroids and testosterone, which I don't remember hearing about that at the time, but I definitely heard about people accusing Castus Menier of actually being a man. This is making me so mad. It was interesting before learning about stuff I didn't know about, but it's interesting now to learn more about stuff I did know about and I do have some context for. So yeah, interesting.
So yesterday I finished reading Better, Faster, Farther by Maggie Mertens, and I really liked this book. It was so interesting, so informative. Like, I learned so much. I think I've said this in all the clips so far. I just, yeah, learned so much every other page. When I was like at home reading this and like my mum was around, I'd just stop and be like, did you know that in 1928 in the Olympics, da 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 da, or like I would be messaging my sister going like, did you know that sports bras were only invented 20 years before you were born? Which, like, it makes sense because I feel like women in sports were not highly regarded. So, like, why would something for women in sports have been invented earlier? But it does also seem wild that, like, only just outside of, like, my lifetime, we had these things first introduced. And yeah, only 11 years before I was born, I think, was the first time that the Olympics had a women's marathon. And like, that's wild to me because like I'm not that old. I'm not that old. But like, what do you mean that only just outside of my lifetime was the first time that there was a women's category at the Olympics? It's like I said earlier, like, it doesn't surprise me because of like society and sexism and like how far women's rights have like come in like statistically such a short amount of time. Like within the 1900s, like within 100 years, things progressed so much for women. So it doesn't surprise me that like we didn't have these things happening until like later than you would think they should have. But it does still like shock me because what do you mean? What do you mean sports bras were only invented in the 70s? What do you mean that in the 80s was the first women's Olympic marathon? Oh man, this book riled me up, but was so interesting. Someone who runs long distance, this was really interesting to learn about like women coming into long distance running, but it was interesting the whole way through, even when we were talking about like sprinting 100 meters, 200 meters, 800 meters, women being allowed to run like a mile. All of that stuff was really interesting to me as well. So like, if you are a runner but like you're like shorter distances or long distances, it's all in here, and I think it's all interesting even if that's not your like forte. I think even if you're not a runner, even if you maybe just are interested in the sports, if you like watching like the London Marathon when it's on telly and stuff like that, just if you're interested in women's history, this is so interesting and like amazing to learn about like the advancements of women in running and like women's accomplishments. And like towards the end, very inspiring. There was a bit about ultra marathons, like running properly long distances and races that last like days. The last section of this was about a woman called Jasmine Paris, who I think it was 2019, she ran the Spine Race, which is this ultra marathon, and it's one of the most difficult ultra marathons, at least in the UK, if not like generally. And it's like done in winter, it's in the dark, it's in the cold, it's over like mountains and hills. She won it, and not just like the women's division, she won it outright, beat every other competitor by several hours, and like got a new course record. And then I was searching it up last night after learning that, and she maintained that record for I think 5 years or so, and then in 2024 a man did beat that record, and now he holds the overall course record. But I think it's so interesting that when you come to like ultra marathons, there are more women winning things outright, not just like, oh, she came first in the women's section. It's like this woman came first out of everyone, and they're breaking course records. And there is like a bunch of questions about like, if you go further distances, are women better at running? Because there is a lot of like evidence and research to support that theory, that women deal better with like sleep deprivation and like just endurance and like prolonged pain and stuff. But there's also a lot of research against it, so it's very inconclusive. But just like from examples, there are a lot of women winning ultramarathons outright, breaking course records, setting new achievements and stuff. So that was really interesting, very inspiring. I got like a little emotional towards the end around that bit actually, and it's really made me want to like find some running documentaries or stuff to watch about like mostly about women running. I do also have a slight interest in men running. Like this year, two men managed a sub 2 hour marathon at the London Marathon, which has never been done before, and they're like breaking world records, which was incredible. So like I am impressed by that. I am impressed by men very occasionally, but my heart will always lie with like women doing amazing things, because I just find it so inspiring. And like when you read this and know that like 100 years ago women weren't even allowed to officially run a mile, and like their records of their times and stuff weren't recorded because like you weren't technically allowed to do it, and women had to fight so hard to be included and allowed to run longer and longer distances and be involved in championships and Olympics and fight to be paid to be like a professional athlete, and were like assaulted and abused just from trying to run a marathon, which they knew they could already do, but they just weren't technically allowed to because it would mess up women's reproductive systems. And if they ran too far, their like poor bodies and like mental state wouldn't be able to cope with it, and they weren't physically or physiologically or psychologically able to run such long distances, and it was unheard of. And then 100 years later, just like a random woman can enter a marathon and do it. It's kind of amazing. I do get a bit emotional, and like find it very inspiring. So if you want to feel inspired, if you want to feel like you're learning something, if you just want to know about more like cool women, it's in here, baby. So yeah, if you're interested in women's history, if you're interested in athletics, highly recommend. I think this was a really great book that like covered things I didn't know, covered things I did know, but gave more like context to them, or I still like learned about things I already knew. I learned more information, and it's done what I think a good non-fiction book should do, that it's made me want to go away and learn more and read more about certain women in here, or learn more about an event or a time in the past of like women's running and stuff like that. And like I said, maybe like find some documentaries or something to watch, because I always love coming away from a non-fiction book going, yeah, I want to know more about that. Not just like, oh, I read that book and I think like I know everything, or like it didn't interest me enough to have me looking for more, but like this has me wanting to learn more, read more, watch more. Highly recommend. So yes, that is it for this Feminist Friday. If you have any like book or documentary recommendations about women running where I can learn more, please do let me know. Leave the suggestions in the comments down below, and I will see you soon with another Feminist Friday. Bye. I'm gonna go for a run.